Hi everyone, my name is Emma and welcome back to the Art and Storytelling Guild. I hope you all had fun with that first activity because I know I had tons of fun hearing your stories and seeing your beautiful art. So from this point on in the guild, the videos are going to sort of build on each other, so I really recommend going back and watching the last video if this is your first time with the guild, and I'll tell you why that is. So in this lesson, I'm going to introduce to you this concept of a story pyramid. So as you can see in the pyramid on screen, you need to have the wider bits before you can get to the top. So this means that you need to have your setting of your story before you can get to your characters or your plot. And why do you need to do that? Well, think about your own life, for example. You go to Tahoe Expedition Academy and you live in Truckee or Incline or wherever. That kind of made you the person that you are today. You'd have been a very different person if you had grown up in another town, another state, or even another country. And even beyond that, what if you were born on another planet? What kind of person would you be? What kind of person would your parents be? This idea is the same for when you're trying to make characters for your story. For example, maybe their world has a lot of monsters that they have to deal with on a daily basis. They're going to be very different people and do very different things than if they didn't have to deal with that. The same thing is true about the characters and the plot of your story. You can't have your plot if you don't know what's going to happen because you don't know who your characters are. If one is a very angry person, then there might be more conflict in your plot. So while thinking about this idea of how your characters build from your setting and your plot builds from your characters, let's look at the first building block today, the setting of your story. Okay, so what are some of the ingredients you're going to need to create a good setting? Well, first of all, you need to know what kind of geography your land is going to have. And by that I mean what kind of land is there. From there, you can move on to the climate of your world, what kind of weather it normally sees. And then once you have those established, you can move on to your plants and animals that would live there. Like what kind of life would exist in your world. After all that is done, you're going to move on to what kind of people would exist in your world. And yes, this is getting more into the character aspect, but this isn't talking about specifically what people and characters would make up your story. It's kind of a general overview of the society that would exist in your fictional world. And I'll go into detail more about all of these in just a minute. But it's important that you know that each of these builds off the previous one, just like the story pyramid we were talking about earlier. You're not going to know what kind of plants and animals are going to live in your world if you don't know what the geography and the climate is going to be like. Because if it's like a mostly ocean world, then there's not going to be a lot of land animals there. And if it's a mostly land world, there's not going to be a lot of ocean animals there. So these are just things to keep in mind when you're creating the setting of your story. Now let's go more in depth about each of the things on this list. So let's start with the first piece you need, the geography of your world. Your world's geography is a type of land that exists there. And by that I mean the stuff we normally think of geography as, the mountains, the plains, the rivers that are there. But this can also be bigger if you want it to be. Your world could have completely different continents than we have on Earth. It could even be mostly ocean or have a little bit of islands here and there. These kinds of things are going to affect everything in your story. From the weather that is going to exist there, to the types of animals that are going to be there, to what your characters are going to be like. So it's important that we start with this before we move on to creating anything else. Now another thing we want to think about when we're world building is the climate of the world. And this kind of goes hand in hand with geography because it's one of the natural things that occurs in your world. So what do I mean when I say climate? Well, I don't mean weather. Weather is the short-term, day-to-day condition of the sky. And that's something you can think about when you're creating your plot. Maybe it was a dark and stormy night, or maybe it was a nice, bright, sunny day. But when we're talking about climate, we mean what is it like normally? If it's a very deserty place, it's going to be hot and dry most of the time. If it's a super mountainy world, then it's going to be very cold a lot. And again, I encourage you that if you want to, your world could even have weather that doesn't even exist on Earth. Either way, it's really important that you understand what kind of weather would be in your world before you try and think about the plants and animals that would live there. Because just like there's different animals in the rainforest than around Tahoe, different plants and animals are going to live in your world depending on what kind of climate is there. So now that we've talked about climate, let's move on to the plants and animals. So once you've thought about the climate and the geography of your world, you can start to think about the kind of life that would exist there. And this stage kind of marks a halfway point where you want to start really thinking about your setting as a whole. That is, how the life there would be affected by the world, and also how it would affect the world itself. For example, in a magical enchanted forest, what would the plants there be useful for? Would they be able to cure diseases? Maybe it's something that'll help your protagonist beat the evil witch. You want to think about this for the life that's going to be much more important in your story. For more background life forms, you may want to think about why it exists there at all. For example, if it's a plant or animal in the desert, what kinds of things would it need to survive there? Like a plant would need very deep roots and not very wide leaves, so it would be able to store a lot of water. Animals would need really big ears or long tails to be able to give off heat. These kinds of things will help your animals and ultimately characters really seem like they're going to belong in your world, rather than just some random things that seem to exist there without any purpose or reason. And the same thing applies to the people that would live in your world. Now we'll talk about the people or the kind of society that would live in your world. Now this is the last piece in the process of building your setting, but since people themselves are confusing, this is also probably the most complicated one. So where do you start when you're trying to think about your fictional society? Well, first you want to think about what kind of resources these people would have available to them. For example, the Native Americans that lived on the Great Plains didn't have any wood available to them, but they did have a lot of bison. So they made sure to use every single part of the bison for everything that they did. All their teepees were made out of bison pelts. Their clothes were made out of bison pelts. The structure of the teepees were made out of bison bones. And they used other parts of the bisons that they didn't need for anything else to help build fires. So you definitely want to think about what these people have around them that they could use in their everyday life. So if there aren't any trees around them, maybe their houses are made out of mud. Or if they're near the coast or a lot of rivers, maybe their food consists mostly of fish. So this is definitely where you want to start when you're thinking about your society. After that, you can start thinking about things like their government. Are they a democracy? Are they a monarchy? Do they have a king? Maybe an emperor? This is going to determine how things are run in your society and how people's everyday lives work. Finally, you can start thinking about the culture of your society. This can be anything from movies, music, books, even jokes that exist there. The culture of the society is largely going to determine how your characters act or think about situations. You're really starting to decide who your characters are as people. But this still isn't getting super specific. We'll do that next time. For now, we've covered all the steps you need to take to create your setting. Now let's talk about how you can effectively talk about it. So let's talk about how you can talk about your setting when you're writing about it. Now, I really encourage you guys to be really free and creative when you're describing things, but there are a couple tricks that can really help your reader connect with what you're writing. And this tip isn't too complicated. It's just about how you describe certain things. Because there are some things that when you're writing about it, you want to describe exactly what it is. And these things are mostly the geography and the land of your world and the life that exists within it. Especially if this life isn't super vital to your story at the moment. So for these, you want to talk about what it looks like, what it sounds like, maybe if you're talking about plants, how it tastes or smells like. These are things that you really want to paint a picture about. You want your reader to be able to almost see what you're talking about. Now, other things like the weather and climate of your world and the society and culture that exists in it, you want to talk more on an emotional level about it. You want to talk about how happy and energetic people felt at the festival in your society. And you want to talk about how tired that a very slow, foggy, rainy sort of day made everybody feel. It's a generally good rule to try and think about what you want your audience to feel when they read your story. And on that note, let's get into what we're going to be doing today. So this activity is going to involve more drawing than the one we did last time. This time I want you guys to start by drawing your setting. I want you guys to pick a couple of the things that we talked about, the geography, the weather, the plants and animals, and the people, and have a couple of those be parts of your drawing. It's okay if not all of them are in your drawing, as that's really hard to do. I want at least a couple of them to be in the picture. Once you're done with your drawing, I want you guys to describe what your setting is like, and this does need to include everything that we talked about. And I'd like you to keep in mind what I just said about how you can start describing all of these things. Finally, I want to remind you guys that when it comes to being creative, there are no wrong answers and no stupid ideas. So I really want you guys to be super creative with these settings that you come up with. So with that, I'll see you guys all back on the group hangout at 2:40, and I absolutely cannot wait to see what you've come up with.